All right. What up, y'all? Happy conclusion to week 9. And with it, additionally, the conclusion of our period 7 studies. Y'all have done a pretty good job of embracing what ends up being most usually the largest portion of the AP test and letting pretty inarguably the time period in the College Board's framework that has the most significant events and turning points. Right? We started this unit with progressivism and this domestic response to some of the problems of the Gilded Age. We talked about imperialism as the U.S. role in the world stage changes dramatically in World War I as well, as despite the U.S. embracing a new role in the world, the U.S. refuses to join the League of Nations. We also discussed the 1920s, right? This decade of significant change for women, for African Americans, to the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance, as well as flappers and the prohibition of alcohol, the Red Scare, of course, is significantly important in terms of how we treat immigrants and social dissent. We talked about the Great Depression, right? This biggest change in the role of government in American history. And then we're going to finish up with World War II, right? The most deadly conflict on the global stage in world history. So obviously, period 7 has a lot going on. Today, our main focus is just to clean up World War II from a military and diplomatic standpoint. As well as at the very tail end, just to talk about some of the consequences of the war on the American economy, on international society as a whole, and also quite significantly on America's role in the world. So let's buckle up. 3 questions for you to consider as you engage in interacting with this video. First, how and why? How and why did the Allied powers win World War II? Second, what were the consequences of World War II on society as a whole? And third, how does the war impact the US's role in the world? So let's begin. As we know, because we talked about this in our live session, the US is, much like World War I, already involved in the war before actually getting involved in fighting the war. It's a little more overt, it's a little more obvious in World War II, as from the get-go, President Roosevelt is going to kind of frame the growing conflict as good versus evil, democracy versus totalitarianism, and in doing so, authorizing the Lend-Lease Act, kind of this conclusion of the U.S. attempts to maintain neutrality through the Neutrality Acts and the cash and carry policy. The Lend-Lease Act is kind of the end of it, like, yeah, if we don't give England stuff, like the war is going to be over and Nazi Germany is going to control all of Europe. So maybe we should just kind of start siding more aggressively with the British. The Lend-Lease Act provides arms directly to Great Britain and other allied powers on credit, instead of on that cash and carry policy. And this is significant because it really does show the end of U.S. neutrality, right? At this point, the U.S. is going to use their own submarines to escort British ships and the like. And the U.S. is no longer neutral. They're just neutral in name only. We see this awesome map, which shows where Lend-Lease aid is going, right? The wider the arrow, the more aid, the more resources, right? We see some going to China, Australia, New Zealand, right? That are trying to fend off Japanese expansionism in the Pacific. We see some going to Northern Europe and to the Soviet Union eventually. It's not till later though, as well as some here to India and South Africa. But the vast majority of aid, the biggest arrow by far, is going to England. Now, FDR and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill are going to get together actually in the Atlantic Ocean on a boat before the U.S. is even before the U.S. is effectively declared into the war. And they're going to agree on some things. FDR says, yeah, I mean, we're probably going to end up in this war sooner than later. So let's get some stuff on the table and make some agreements. And what they come up with is pretty significant in terms of what happens for after the war. And it's called the Atlantic Charter. It's agreed to by just those two, FDR and Churchill, the British and the Americans. And they commit to using the war to establish secure self-determination. Self-determination is really key here. This idea that nations should be able to decide for themselves what type of government they want to live under. This is a way of arguing for anti-imperialism, right? Decolonization. That's a pretty big deal. And free trade, right? Let's get rid of mercantilism and tariffs and just create a world in which trade is more fair and open for all to engage in. Also, we're going to fight a war so that nations no longer pursue territorial expansion, like conquering their neighbors for their own land. And let's lay out this international organization. We'll call it the United Nations. That's going to be like the League of Nations 2.0, but actually do its job. Now, funny enough, all the stuff in the Atlantic Charter was actually also in Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. His proposal in World War I to that idea of peace without victory, of self-determination, anti-colonization, disarmament, free trade, no more territorial expansion, League of Nations. Right. So here, when Wilson proposes it in World War I, a lot of the European nations are that win the war are opposed to this idea because they want to feel victorious. But then the World War I, which is called at the time the War to End All Wars, obviously doesn't end all wars, because here we are again in World War II. So it appears, at least, that society has learned their lesson from World War I, and FDR and Churchill are on the same page regarding what to do after World War II. So it ends up being Pearl Harbor that officially enters the U.S. into the war, and it's not German aggression. I don't think Germany necessarily wanted to fight the United States at this time, but Japan did. Before this, in the year prior, the U.S. has responded to Japanese expansionism, not just expansionism, but like conquering of territory throughout the Pacific with economic sanctions. We can call it economic warfare if you want. The U.S. has prohibited the trade of any steel and any oil to Japan as kind of a slap on the wrist or a punishment for what they've done in China, and in French Indochina and in Burma. And the U.S. has also required Japan stop expanding and get out of China. Right? The U.S. looks at China as something of an ally. We can go back to like the open door policy and this desire to create trade relations with China. So the U.S. has also frozen all economic assets the Japanese have in U.S. financial institutions. So you can make an argument that the U.S. Had already declared economic war on the Japanese as a way to try to get them to stop their ways, and Japan responds by making it official and attacking the United States at Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii. The morning of December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launch a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Almost 2,500 Americans are killed. FDR jumps on the radio that next day and gives one of his very famous, you guys should know at this point, he does this often, fireside chats, and he says a date which will live in infamy. Now, it would have been much worse for the United States Navy, but many of their larger ships were out to sea, not at the port, not at the base, out to sea on some training exercises, which actually saved the Pacific Naval Fleet from total destruction. But those boats that are left behind in Pearl Harbor are decimated by this attack by the Japanese. So the very next day, the U.S. declares war just on Japan, because it's Japan that attacked the U.S. But because Japan, Germany, and Italy have a pact together, Germany and Italy respond to the U.S. declaring war on Japan by declaring war on the U.S. And thus now, with the span of one day, basically, the U.S. now has a war on their hands in the Pacific against the Japanese, and a war on their hands in the Atlantic against the Germans and the Italians. And that sets up really the rest of the war, with one more caveat. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union adds the Soviet Union to the Allied side as well. But we'll say that for a couple minutes. Gives us this good perspective, this good cartoon, which I think helps us kind of get our minds into the understanding of how the U.S. could authorize Japanese internment. This cartoon is good. It's on your handout. This argument that the Japanese distracted the American people with potential peace negotiations while stabbing America in the back on December 7th with Jap treachery. Right? We see the way this man is depicted in a very stereotypical way, which starts getting us to understand some of the race influence on Japanese internment. So early on in the war, the U.S. spends their time building up their resources, building up their capacity, getting their army together. And a couple really important conferences take place early in the war. The first is Casablanca, the second is Tehran. Now, Casablanca is January of 1943, so the U.S. has been in the war for about a year, and not a whole lot has changed yet. It's just FDR and Churchill together, just the two of them, these two leaders, and they agree. There they are together, right? There's FDR chilling, there's Churchill in his big old oversized suit, and their military advisors. And they're at Casablanca, they agree that they're going to only there's no like negotiated peace that's going to happen. Like this war is going to be fought until the Germans declare unconditional surrender. We can't allow Germany to say, all right, never mind, let's just kind of chill and leave things the way they are. That's not going to work. We're not going to stop fighting this war until unconditional surrender is reached. On the second conference at Tehran in November of 1943, that's when all three of the leaders come together, Stalin of the Soviet Union, FDR, and Churchill. And it is here where Stalin is begging the Allied powers, like, you need to invade Europe. You need to open a Western front because we're getting slaughtered on the East in the Soviet Union. You got to take some of the pressure off of us by invading Germany from somewhere else. And that's where FDR and Churchill will agree to open a Western front against Germany. I'll show you some maps here in just a second. And it's where they agree that as the war continues, the Soviets will invade Germany from the East. The British and Americans will invade Germany from the West, and together none of the three sides will agree to anything except unconditional surrender of Germany. Right? There's some echoes here of World War I, right? When the Soviet Union just kind of like negotiates their separate peace after the Bolshevik Revolution and then just bounces. In this case, the three of them are saying like, no, the three of us are together going to stay in the war until the war is over. But when the U.S. gets involved in 1942, 1943, it is all bad. It's not good. It's not good at all. We have Hitler and his adoring followers here on the left. We have the American troops in the Philippines here on the right. But the Nazis have rolled across basically the entirety of Europe, right? France falls. France always falls. Poland has fallen. The Spanish and the Italians are allied with the Germans. It's just a hot mess. And even North Africa has also fallen under Nazi control. In the Pacific, the Japanese in 1943 are at the apex of their territorial control. They've captured just a vast amount of Pacific islands and giant sections of continental Asia as well. They've also kicked the U.S. forces out of the Philippines, right? The U.S. colony in the Philippines with military bases they've been removed from in quite embarrassing fashion. As the U.S. soldiers are taken prisoner and taken on what's called the Bataan Death March across the jungles of the Philippines, where thousands of American soldiers are going to die at the hands of Japanese soldiers. And Douglas MacArthur, the American leader of the troops in the Pacific, upon being removed from the Philippines, says, "Don't worry, I shall return. I will be back to save the Philippines from the Japanese. We'll get these islands back." And sure enough, he does. It just takes a couple years. In the Philippines, the U.S. loses 11,000 prisoners of war, which is just alarming. On the Bataan Death March that I told you about. And, Germany is at the peak of their territorial control. Japan is at the peak of their territorial control. And things just, in general, aren't looking incredibly well. And that's what it looks like, right? Germany has conquered all of Europe except the neutral Swiss, who are minding their own business. And here we have, right, Italy, France, Germany, all of what used to be Austria, Hungary, Romania, Poland, Eastern Europe. They've even controlled Norway and Denmark for better access to the sea. Worrisome. And they have not yet invaded the Soviet Union. So as you recall from last week, the Soviets and the Nazis have this non-aggression pact, right, to not fight each other. So Germany's looking pretty good here. They have basically all of mainland Europe under their control. And in the Pacific, it's similar. Right? The Japanese also have enormous territorial control. As of late 1942, this red ring is the extent of their control, but they've controlled the Philippines and French Indochina down here, and much of Manchuria in China, and parts of Korea and Indonesia. So what we see here is enormous Japanese expansion, an enormous German expansion, and the U.S. and their friends are going to have to find a way to fight back on both fronts. So by the end of 1942, things look quite dark. The Allies face defeat. There's been a chain of spectacular victories for the Axis powers, like Pearl Harbor, like Germany marching into the Soviet Union. But despite what looks on the surface like a soon-to-be Axis victory, there are some disguised underlying weaknesses of the Axis powers and some disguised underlying strengths of the Allied powers, which both would play out over the next 3.5 years until the war ends. Now, Japan and Germany never coordinate. They never work together to fight a coordinated war effort against the United States. Part of that is pride, as both nations are run by totalitarian, egotistical, crazy people. And part of it's racism as well, as the Germans look at the Japanese as a lesser race, and the Japanese look at themselves as a superior race to the Germans. So neither side wants to ask the other for help. Both sides think they're better than the other. So they're fighting the same enemy, but they never fight as if they are friends. They never coordinate strategies, which probably would have been very helpful. This allows, for example, the US to focus primarily on Europe first, deal with that, get that into a better situation, and then turn their fuller attention to the Pacific. Additionally, these defeats obscure the Allies' strengths that are going to play out over the longer run. The two strengths that Germany and Japan can't keep up with is the manpower of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has almost endless supplies of men to just throw into battle because their population is so large. And the second is the productive capacity of the United States. Because the US can produce so much, so many tanks, so many planes, so many boats, so many everything, so many trucks, so many jeeps, so many guns, and eventually so many bombs, that is a longer term strength that takes a little longer to exert because you have to ramp up your capacity and get to a place in which you can use it effectively, that over time, it's those two things that are going to wear down the Axis powers. But the real mistake, and history would never be the same because of it, is Hitler invading the Soviet Union. Hitler and the Soviets, they have this agreement, this non-aggression pact, basically a pact to not be friends, but not to be enemies. But the idea is Hitler's priority is to obliterate communism. This idea that everybody is the same runs against the beliefs of Hitler and his fascist regime. So he violates this non-aggression agreement. He invades the Soviet Union with what's called Operation Barbarossa, sending 4 million men into the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union also has a lot of Jews, which also is a motivating factor for Hitler in his quest to cleanse the world of the Jewish population via the final solution when there was a Holocaust. But he sends 4 million men along a 2,000-mile front to 3 main cities in the Soviet Union. Now, the problem there is that the farther this advance gets from Germany, the longer their supply lines are, the harder it is to get food and resources and supplies to these soldiers. And the Soviet Union is freaking massive. And in the winter, it turns out it's quite cold there. So the German army is going to advance quite quickly into the Soviet Union, but at a awful cost. In the next 3 years until the war ends, 90% of German deaths don't happen in the West fighting the US and Great Britain. 90% of the deaths for the German army in the next 3 years are going to happen on the Eastern Front fighting the Soviet Union. What Hitler does here is he thinks, like, I'm cool in Europe. I've controlled the whole continent of Europe, so I can just turn east now and give all my attention to the Soviets. But that's going to change, and then Hitler's going to have to fight a war on 2 fronts. That's going to be the final end. And one of the reasons why I told you at the beginning when I answered the question, how and why the Allies won the war, this is one of the reasons. So this is what it looks like in the Atlantic theater in Europe, right? Like Germany is going to get all the way to the 3 big cities they wanted to conquer: Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad, right? That 3-pronged attack in the Soviet Union. But you can see here how far they've gotten from Germany, right? And with that, then that supply line gets longer and longer and longer. And it's at the Battle of Stalingrad in early 1943 that the Soviet Union begins to turn the tide, begins to push back. Because in January, it's freezing cold and frozen. And they're going to take advantage of that to begin. Really, this is the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. But this is why you can see why Stalin was so insistent that his friends open a Western Front attack over here to get Germany from all of its troops being on the Eastern Front fighting the Soviets. England and America are actually not going to start here in Europe. They're going to start down below in North Africa, with what becomes known as Operation Torch. They say, look, we can't attack Germany here in France because they're too fortified. We can't attack them in Germany because they're too fortified. But if we come down through here, we think Italy's soft. Right? The Allies look at Italy as the soft underbelly of the Axis. Right? Like, why attack somebody where they're strong if you can attack somebody where they're weak? That's exactly what they do, starting in North Africa with Operation Torch, and then through Italy with what becomes known as Operation Avalanche. And they begin getting a foothold here in Europe that way, quite successfully. Shortly after, Italy bows out and says, never mind, we're out. Sure enough, that assumption that they were the soft underbelly was accurate. But it's not until D-Day, one of the more significant days of U.S. military history and thus U.S. national history, D-Day on June 6th of 1944, that the tide of the war begins to change here in the Western Front. On D-Day, I'll show you a map here in a second. It's the largest amphibious invasion in world history. The British and the Americans and the Canadians and the Australians and other allied powers are going to launch a huge naval invasion from England here to Normandy in France, quite successfully. And once that takes place and the allied powers have a foothold in Italy and a foothold in France, then it just becomes only a matter of time as the Soviet Union comes from the east and the British and Americans come from the west, and the war then ends. This is what it looks like, right? Just this little foothold at Normandy, after all these boats and troops come across, are then going to spread out across Europe and really make the Nazis fight a war on multiple fronts, and then it's only a matter of time till the war ends. So it's a big deal. May 7th of 1945, May 7th. So, you know, it still takes 3 years to really free Europe from Nazi control. Is Victory in Europe Day as the Germans surrender, and the war in Europe is over. The war in the Pacific is not yet over, though. Now, in the Pacific, the big turning point there, the version you could say of D-Day is, there's a couple we could pick from, but I'm going to say it's the Battle of Midway, which is right here. Now, the Battle of Midway, Pearl Harbor was in December of 1941. 6 months later, Japan basically tries again. Right? They tried to again get close enough to attack Hawaii, and it's at Midway where the U.S. Are able to inflict heavy enough damage on the Japanese Navy that Japan will never recover from it because they lack the industrial capacity to quickly replace destroyers and ships and boats and the like. So in the Pacific, one of the things you have to know College Board wise is that the Americans take on an approach what's called island hopping. Right? All these islands in the Pacific are controlled at the time by the Japanese. And the Americans say, like, we're not going to take all these islands at once, but if we can control one island and then hop to the next, and then the next, and then the next, then eventually we'll be close enough to Japan to just take planes and bomb them, and that will end the war. So what starts down here, the Battle of Coral Sea, the beginnings of island hopping, right, to New Guinea, to the Philippines, and then eventually to Japan's doorstep with Iwo Jima and Okinawa off the coast of southern Japan. By April and June of 1945, island hopping is successful enough that the U.S. can fly missions over Tokyo, over the big cities of Japan, with just a plane there and back because they have islands close enough to Japan. This island hopping strategy works. Now, in this process, the Japanese are going to get desperate and show the type of fight they are willing to commit to win World War II, beginning in 1944 with Leyte Gulf, with kamikaze pilots, pilots that are sent in planes, not with no intention of coming back, of using their planes as weapons to attack U.S. ships, to try to sink American ships, basically by committing suicide as soldiers. So that tells the American forces, the American leadership, that Japan is going to not give up without drastic measures. Now, throughout this time period, really since the beginning of the war, A top secret project had been ongoing called the Manhattan Project, where they are attempting to harness the power of a split atom to launch, to create an atomic bomb. The guy in charge, Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, FDR is funding this. It's super top secret. The vice president, Truman, doesn't even know about it. Super, super top secret. Successfully in the summer of 1945, the bomb is tested successfully in the deserts of the American Southwest. Now, by the time it's tested, FDR has recently died. Now Harry Truman, who just takes on the White House, right? It's like, oh, we're fighting a two-front war, and I have this new bomb, and I just showed up here. I don't know what the hell is going on. Not quite as bad of a situation as our boy Martin Van Buren, who shows up in the White House right when the Panic of 1837 starts, but still, he's left in a challenging situation to make such a drastic decision. And really, the decision becomes like the U.S. can either invade mainland Japan, within the back of the U.S. decision makers' minds, this kamikaze ideal, this philosophy of no surrender. What would that look like fighting in the streets of Japan if their entire civilian population embraces a similar ideology? Or using this new weapon, atomic bombs, to drop on Japan and see what happens. Conservative estimates on what it would cost the U.S. if they invaded Japan is 350,000 Allied casualties. So Truman makes the decision to use the bombs instead of the invasion to save Allied lives. Now, I'll let you make the assessment on your morality as to whether or not that was the right decision. It's not a decision that's not a decision I can make for you, but it's important to understand the context by which this takes place, as well as the way that the atomic bombs dramatically end World War II. August 6th of 1945, so just about a month and a half after the first time it was tested, the U.S. drops the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 140,000 people are killed, mostly civilians, and tens of thousands are injured. For generations since then, but especially for the generation that was alive then, significant victims of radiation sickness, of illness, like a huge increase in cancer and other illnesses that are caused by radiation. And 80% of the buildings in the city of Hiroshima are flattened, are gone. I know the video that I had you watch on your extension day had a little bit of footage of like the post, right, where it's just a decimated landscape. The U.S. says to Japan, like, surrender or we'll drop another one. And Japan does not surrender. So 3 days later, the U.S. drops another one, this time on the city of Nagasaki, in which half the casualties of the first round, but still significant, 70,000 people killed, 60,000 injured. And the U.S. again says surrender or we'll drop another one. Now, fortunately, the Japanese surrender because there was no other one. The U.S. only had 2 atomic bombs at that time. Formal surrender is signed on August the 14th. Excuse me, formal surrender is signed September 2nd, but as of August 14th, informal surrender has been declared. And that is considered VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day, and World War II is over. Now, it's a drastic impact on the world as a whole. 70 million people died during World War II. Approximately 4% of the world's population, which is just an alarmingly high number. Alarmingly high. 25 million military casualties, 45 million civilian casualties. Right? It's the first time we see a war in which there's more civilian casualties than military casualties. And that comes from a couple things, right? The indiscriminate bombing of cities. Right? The US for the last 6 months of the war is bombing Tokyo every night. Tokyo is the biggest city in Japan. Right? Then drops atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's 210,000 dead civilians right there. So the indiscriminate bombing from all sides, the Germans, the British, the Americans, but also the amount of civilians that die in the Soviet Union during the war because of starvation and because of the German advance, but also because of war crimes, the Holocaust committed by the Germans against the Jews in Europe, the Nanking massacre or the rape of Nanking committed by the Japanese people, the Japanese soldiers in Asia, the Bataan Death March in the Philippines, again, committed by the Japanese military. So in the case of World War II, it's pretty significant how the war impacts civilian populations with casualties in a way that we've not seen previously with wars. For the US, The US loses 400,000 soldiers in the war, which is significant, but it pales in comparison to the contributions of the Soviet Union and others. And the war costs for the Americans $341 billion in 1940s money, which is the equivalent of $4.5 trillion today. That right there is why World War II ends the Great Depression, whereas the New Deal could not, because this massive amount of government spending to supply the war effort is more than sufficient to drag the US quite quickly out of the Great Depression. Now, one excellent thing to come out of World War II is the United Nations. At the tail end of the war, the United Nations is created, an international organization to promote stability, to promote international peace. It is a peacekeeping organization. This is important for period 8, so make sure you take note of this. The UN is not necessarily a series of alliances. It is a peacekeeping organization that has representatives from all the major countries in the world, where they can debate issues that affect them all. It is led by what's called the Security Council, kind of the 5 leading countries at the time: the US, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. And the big significance here is that the US joins the United Nations, whereas the US refused to join the League of Nations. So in terms of the change in the role of the US in the world, the change is pretty drastic and significant, as the US embraces a newfound responsibility and leadership position on international affairs that the US had shunned and turned down at 1919 at the end of World War I. So the war ends the Great Depression, right? There's no other way around it. Right? Factories are running at higher than full capacity. Not all, don't say all in history classes, but so many of the US industrial powers turn their industrial production to wartime production. Ford is the best example. As Ford uses the assembly line, right, that had been pumping out cars in the 1920s to pump out one B-52, those giant bombers, one plane per hour out of their factories in Detroit, Michigan. People also save a lot of money because of rationing, because they are not allowed to buy certain things and because they can only buy limited of other things. So the US people have a lot of money in the bank and they're ready to spend it after the war, and they will. I'm talking about that in the 1950s. We also see a big economic boom in the South. This is really the first time we see economic advancement on an industrialized scale in the southern states, and it's because of army bases in the South. The Army is going to put all their new bases to fight World War II in the South because of climate, because it's warmer and sunnier year-round. And one other significant consequence of the war is the national debt, which grows to $260 billion throughout this war, which is 6 times its size on December 7th, 1941, when the US enters World War II. So hopefully that does it. Hopefully we've answered all 3 questions. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Good luck on your period 7 test, which is coming next week. And I will talk to you hopefully soon. Bye, y'all.